Hi, I'm Mark Waid. Welcome to the Dom of X podcast.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be in the world. I am Dom of X, comicreleases.com, assistant editor, and today I am joined by the man who created Impulse, edited Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. You know him. He is one of my heroes. He is Mark Waid. How are you doing today?
Good, doing well today.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you here, and I'm glad to be talking about the whole world of comics and everything else of that sort. But
Sure, happy to be here.
before we sort of get into that, I got to ask a couple of miscellaneous questions before we get to the meat of it. How
Sure.
have you kept the flame going strong into your 60s? What's kept you writing and loving superheroes for this whole time?
I love these characters. Really think that's the key to everything. It would be harder to do this and keep it going if I were writing, a bunch of characters I didn't care about, or if you hired me to do, and this happens from time to time, people like CrossGen or whatever, they'll want to hire me to help start a universe, and
Hmm.
that's great. But at the end of the day, with some exceptions, I'm gonna do most of my best work on the characters that I've loved since I was a kid.
No, that's awesome. Just to have that, sort of going in throughout for pretty much your entire life. And
Yeah.
what also made you decide to move back to DC in 2021 with Batman Superman World's Finest? I know that you were
This,
doing work at Marvel with Doctor Strange,
you-
and I had read some of
right,
it.
doing a lot of work at Marvel. I was just I A managerial change there resulted in 3 phone calls from editors that same day asking me to come back and do stuff. So 2 of them before lunch. So that was nice. So the
Nice.
door was thrown open a few years ago, and they've been great to me ever since and let me do pretty much whatever I feel like doing. And I'm I'm benefiting, they're benefiting, we're having a great time.
Oh, that's awesome. And yeah, you know what? Let's not even waste any more time. Let's go ahead and start off with the brand new book that you're going to be debuting with Dan Mora on the interiors and the covers, and that is Justice League Unlimited. Tamara Bonvillain, I believe, is
Yep.
supplying the colors as well. I gotta ask, like, what do you think makes the Justice League so unique and so different compared to every single other team in the DC universe? Like, what made you want to go back and say it's time to write the Justice League again?
There's two different answers. One, if it's just the more traditional Justice League of 7 or 8 people, what makes that unique is that it's the All Stars. It is the All Star team. What makes Justice League Unlimited interesting and unique to me and fun, not that Justice League isn't fun, but Justice League Unlimited being fun, is that we've thrown open the doors to everyone in the DC universe who considers themselves a good guy. They are welcome to be a member of the Justice League. It doesn't mean that their membership will last forever. There are going to be some guys who are going to be jerks, and at some point we're going to have to throw people off the team. But by and large, whether you're Black Orchid or Hawk and Dove
Hmm.
or Superman or Wonder Woman or Wonder Girl or whoever, you are considered a member of the Justice League if you want to be. It doesn't mean that Titans doesn't still exist, Justice Societies doesn't exist. Those teams still exist. And they are, it's more of an invitation to them. No one's required to be a member of the Justice League. It's just, if you want to help us, we've got a place for you at the Watchtower.
And to have that spot at the Watchtower with the DC All In special and just getting back to the sort of, hey, remember like those good times when Grant Morrison introduced that back in JLA, and now it's like we're getting back to those roots again, and that's some of my favorite Justice League material in general. So to see you bringing that back into the fold, it's pretty awesome.
Thanks.
Of course. And this also marks a 20-year gap in you writing these characters, right? Because you did a JLA original graphic novel with Brian Hitch, and of course you got to write JLA for a good stint up until issue 60, right? So
Right.
what's the difference between writing this team now and writing it in the early 2000s, and what have you learned in that time frame that's probably going to influence your team, you on the team stint this time?
Wow, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it being that long a gap, but what I've learned is I've just learned better storytelling. I've just been absorbing things like a sponge, whether it's from comics, TV, movies, novels, short stories. It's been absorbing storytelling techniques for the last 20 years, and hopefully that makes my job a little easier. I've also been sort of retro engineering some older stuff that was successful to see what worked. When Paul Levitz and Keith Giffen were doing Legion of Superheroes, how did that manage? There's 25 characters on that team. How did that manage to work? Justice League in some of its bigger days where it's had a bunch of different characters, retro engineered that, take it apart. How does that work? So I'm learning that. The challenge, as much as anything, is coming up with obviously a threat or a series of threats that's big enough to handle every hero on Earth. Not that they'll all be in every issue, because I don't want to kill Dan Mora. but even if you're just sending a few Justice Leaguers, it feels like it has to be a big enough threat to be worthy of the Justice League. Otherwise, it's just, why doesn't Superman just handle this, or why doesn't the Flash just handle this? The other challenge is there's 20 years of continuity that I'm not completely caught up on. I've read most of the DC stuff over the years, but I haven't read every single DC book, which is why I was surprised this morning to find out that Alec Holland is no longer the Swamp Thing. But that means, okay, I'm going to go spend a couple of hours reading back issues and absorbing that, and little stuff like that is a challenge, but it's fun, because if the answer to my problem is to read comic books, there are much worse problems to have.
Oh, there are. I think that's sort of the beauty of this industry just in general, is like, I'm a content creator, but I get to read these things for a full-time hobby. Like, how many people get that opportunity to say, I'm enjoying what I'm doing on and off camera, right? And sort of the same thing.
How many people can make their hobby their career? Exactly.
And just to hear that, I mean, it's super phenomenal that you've not only been able to sort of learn some of those things in the last 20, but also get to catch up on. I think a lot of great stuff has come out from not only the big two, but from pretty much every company in the last 20 years. Yeah,
the competition for eyeballs is fiercer than I think it was back then. I think that it's fiercer not only because just overall the writing in comics is better than it was. I mean, it was fine 20 years ago, but I mean, it's better now than it's ever been. And the dominance of superhero comics in the direct sales marketplace and the comics marketplace was so much bigger 20 years ago than it is today. Superheroes are still pretty much the dominant genre when it comes to comic stores. But outside of comic stores, not necessarily. And even still, there's so much good creator-owned work out there, so much really interesting small publisher work or indie publisher work that is competing for attention and doing so because it's really good. So it's a little different in that way, too. You can't just assume Justice League is going to be the bombshell best-selling book every month like it was when Grant Morrison was doing it.
So I mean, obviously we had a big difference in evolution in the gap and of the sorts, and you're just sort of trying to fix yourself, onto that, and they say, hey, like, writing Justice League, but that doesn't mean this is the book you're gonna, and all that stuff for sure.
Well, it also means that Dan Mora and I have to swing for the fences a little harder than every single month, but that's okay. That's a good challenge I have.
Right, because I got into Justice League with the New 52 run. My cousin gave me a trade paperback of the Jeff Johns, Jim Lee origin story. And it was like, all right, they're fighting Darkseid in the first arc. Like, I didn't expect that as like a 10-year-old kid, but that was just something that I had to deal with. And like sort of the same thing, I guess, with you now. I mean, you are, because my question to you, I guess, supposedly, right? Like, is this gonna be like the flagship book of the DCU? Like, I talked with Jeremy Adams and John Layman on previous interviews, and they've talked to me about how either your ideas influence their work in meetings, or it's events happening specifically in this book pushing on for that. So, and it feels like a complete 180, because like from what you were doing back in the 2000s, because that was, from my viewpoint, like what you were doing wasn't the same as what Ed Brubaker was doing in Batman, but it seems like now it's like you're the one pushing all the levers this time.
It seems to be. And the good news is we have a great editorial team at DC. We have great creators, and I think another difference between years ago and today is that we're all much tighter. Like, we talk to each other a lot more often. I just got a text from Joshua Williamson as we were sitting here recording, wanting to talk about Superman. We're all talking to each other. There is a general esprit de corps
Mhm.
of, hey, we're all on the same team. Let's pull in the same direction. And for the time being, for the next year, Justice League Unlimited will be the flagship book. It doesn't mean we're dictating to other people what stories they tell. It just means that we're trying to keep a tight coordination on everything, so that I'm not using a character that you just killed off last month or what have you. We're trying to keep some consistency across the line, and Justice League should be the torchbearer for that.
Completely agreed. And what also can you just sort of tell me about the usage of the characters that you're bringing along? Because in JLA, you were using the Grant Morrison roster more or less, right? The
Sure,
one that was
more or less.
introduced right in 1996. But now you have the title Unlimited, which was it your idea that Unlimited was pitched along, or was it someone else upstairs?
It was DC's idea actually, but I was all for it. The thinking was, Dan and I were having such a good time on World's Finest, throwing in every character but the kitchen sink, just
Mhm.
throwing every character that I love into that. Why don't we try to replicate that same energy in a book that is taking place in the here and now? Same idea, basically. Basically they were counting on the same appeal to me, which was, wait, I get to play with everybody? Awesome.
It's like pick and
So,
choose between
right.
every single
And so
character.
And so that's a big part of the coordinating the book, is that it is a very mission specific book, in that every issue, sometimes over the course of a couple of issues, there's a big mission, and we pick the leaguers that would seem to fit that mission best. There may be a smaller side mission, and we pick the leaguers that would fit that best and handle that best, and so forth and so on. So there's always two or three different things going on in the series at any given time, all handled by different characters in the DC universe, some small, some big, some small that become big. And that's, you're getting your money's worth. There's always something going on from page to page.
Right. And especially with the seemingly unlimited, no pun intended, resources that you can
Yeah,
pour on.
exactly.
And as much as Dan Mora wants to draw, I mean, like, who are you to say no
Yeah.
to?
And Dan loves drawing. Dan's big dream is he's that George Perez mentality of, can I please draw everybody at some point or another?
Which is, I mean, just a pretty remarkable thing, especially
Yeah.
when I first noticed him on Grant Morrison's Klaus. It was like, okay, this person was born to draw comics, wakes over the way to DC, and it's
Yeah.
like, wow. I mean, I'm
Yep.
just absolutely impressed by it. But yeah, like, do you plan on, because say for some of these characters, right? You're talking about the Jefferson Pierces, the Rex Masons, even Ryan Choi and Ray Palmer. Like, are these just going to be sort of like one and dones with the characters like appearing in the book, or is it going to be more so about like stay here for maybe a couple of issues, and about how is that going to work out?
It's more of that. I mean, here's the thing. And the most creative part of the book, and this was true no matter when I was writing Justice League. Like, I don't own the character Star Sapphire, for instance. That belongs to the Green Lantern book. That belongs to them. They get to decide what happens in general terms with Star Sapphire. I don't own Black Lightning. I mean, in the sense of, whatever creative team over here is doing a Black Lightning book, and their editor, and they're working on their own stories. And so you can't have giant, huge, life-changing events to happen to those characters in Justice League because they've got their own books. But what you can do, and what you can own, quote unquote, is their relationship, as how these two characters interact with each other. And is there an attraction there? Is there a rivalry there? Is there, do they become best friends? Do they become, does one think the other is a jerk? Do they find they work together very well in a specific way? That's the same with Ryan and Ray the Adams. That's the same way with Aquaman and Flash, or whoever.
Right.
Like pulling in these characters. And so a lot of them will be starring pretty much in every issue: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the big three, Flash. The ones you see on the cover of issue one, basically, are the ones that are going to be in most issues. But there's always room, and I make room for there to be, room for the Shining Knights and Stargirls and whoever in the DC universe.
For sure, and then that's wonderful to hear, because it's nice having a cast that you can stay with a book for as long as possible, but it's also like,
Right.
if you want to bring a guest star in and they throw some flames on
Yeah.
and try to like, there's nothing wrong with like having those characters bounce off of each other. I think that's the
No, it's
beauty of
really
these teams.
and it's kind of an audition. I mean, that's just how I treated it in Justice League, and how I'm treating it in Action Comics right
Mm-hmm.
now to some degree, is
Mm-hmm.
bringing in older characters that you may not be familiar with, but if I've done my job right, by the end of that arc, you're going, I want more of this. I want that. There's a breakout character in the Action Comics
Mm-hmm.
run that my editor had never even given 2 seconds to thinking about until we used him. And after 12 issues, he's like, we have got to find a place for that. He's so cool. So there you go.
I love the synchronous just sort of communication between you and all the other creators. It's like this
Yeah.
packed house of like flowing creativity. Just wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
It's I'm also thinking about this too, because in 2007 you did a Brave and the Bold series with the late legendary George Perez, along
Right.
with Jerry Ordway. Some of my favorite like team up issues are in that run. I gotta ask, like, do you plan on maybe bringing like an annual or two, maybe every now or so, to have those two like sort of balance each other, like, because that would be awesome
It would be awesome. I mean, I'm kind of doing that in
in Batman.
in
Right.
in World's Finest, in the sense that it's Superman and Batman, but here's Metamorpho, here's Batman and Superman, but here's the Metal Men. That to me is so much fun, to take two characters that you wouldn't think would have any relationship or anything to say to each other, and throwing them in the same story. Like, I'm pretty sure that I was the first person to put Superman and Catwoman together in the same story, having an adventure. I'm pretty sure we were lucky enough to be the first people to do a Nightwing Deadman team up, because they're both circus performers. That sort of thing. I love looking at the entire roster of DC characters and finding the team ups that are unexpected and doing those.
Oh, for sure. And that, I mean, that's just part of the beauty of DC, is like you can throw in whatever golden, silver, bronze age character and say like, hey,
Yep.
go interact with this person for one or two issues and just make it as much fun as possible. Right?
Yeah.
And I mean that's sort of the beauty of what I see about the company. I talked about this with Layman a bit in my interview with him on Titans, because he's sort of bringing the like one shot /2/3 issue story arc sort of structure along with his books. And obviously with your Justice League, there were some arcs where they were only 2 to 4 issues long. They weren't like these long sprawling 12 issue epics. I mean, but Tower of Babel was only 4 issues and a Secret Origins story. So I have to ask, do you plan on doing some of those like 2 to 3 arc formats? Is it going to be like 6-7 issues decompressed, or how do you plan to bring along with storytelling on that front?
And the current plan is for this initial story to run about 5 issues, give or take. Could be 5, could be 6. A lot of that just depends on the availability of the artists, so that we're not, rather than have a fill-in in the middle of a story, it's just better to be able to plan to, if Dan Mora needs a month off 6 months from now, well, let's build a story around that, so we can have a guest artist step in and handle that, rather than interrupt the flow of the story with 2 or 3 different artists. So that's some of it. I have an idea that will carry us through the year. It is not the same as like the Action Comic story, which builds on itself and is really just one big story. I have a through line, an underscore, a subplot, if you will, that builds into a big plot that will carry us through the year. But that leaves plenty of room for side missions and one-offs and that kind of thing.
For sure. And that's great to hear. Again, just the differences between, hey, like 6-7 issues versus some of those like 1-2 shots that we can all have fun with, like in between the big arcs. So
exactly.
And I guess my last question on JLU, just sort of for a bit, because I know that you probably can't tease as much as you'd like to. We got a lot, like there is a whole roster of DC villains that you can same with heroes. I feel like for DC villains, you can also pick and choose like easy, and they have to be as like big a threats. Are there any curveballs that you're planning to throw with the antagonists that these guys have to face, or is it?
There's one enormous curveball. But I can't really get into it. It's more of a back half of the year kind of thing. but it's one we've been talking about at DC for longer than I've been working on Justice League.
Okay. I love that tease. I love that tease
Cool.
right there. And I guess just sort of as a side note, because you've been part of many Legion of Superhero stories, both
Yeah.
editing, co-writing, and writing, and also rebooting.
Hmm.
We've had the Legion, like you've seen the Legion twice, right? Twice completely rebooted, where DC said, wipe the clean slate. Let's
Right.
try to reintroduce a sort of some of these characters.
Hmm.
My question is, do you think that there's still, obviously the DC All In special ties in a little bit
Right.
with that, and you get to see that. Do you still think that the Legion of Superheroes has their own spot in the DC universe after so many years? Uh, I know it's a little below the question, but
It's hard. It's hard I think so. I mean, I genuinely think so. And I'm not the only writer of one of the big books that thinks so. So maybe there's something there. But it's it's hard because we have thrown continuity to the wind with that series so often. And I wonder if we haven't broken it that way. I don't take responsibility for the couple of times I've done it, because those were editorial
right.
edicts. Those were, if you want to write the book, this is what we need. And no one loves DC history more than I do.
Mhm.
Nobody. No one loves Legion history more than I do. Nobody.
Right.
It is, every bit of that is still in my head. And everything about the Silver and Bronze Age Legion I love. But it's if Brian Bendis and Ryan Sook couldn't get people interested in the Legion of Superheroes, I don't know what it's going to take.
Mm-hmm. Because that was a beautifully illustrated book, and even if I think you disagreed with some of the way or with the execution of how Bendis handled it, like I really appreciate that he tried to bring along the diversity of
Yeah,
characters and separate, people in the Legion, and it was like, man, this is only 11 issues. Like I thought, a Legion run would last a little bit longer than
yeah,
that.
I think we all did. But the and kudos to him on really underscoring the diversity and inclusivity of the team. I mean, that's great. The problem is that so many people who want to see the Legion again, they are specifically looking for, I want to see the Bronze Age Legion again. That's my Legion, they're saying. And so it's really hard to reconcile the two. Like, most of the Legion fans who have been fans for years and years and years and decades, um, they are beholden to the old Legion.
Right.
And to some degree, it seems like that's the only thing that's going to make them happy. At the same time, you don't want to just brush everything Brian did under the bus, because what kind of message does that send? That we would prefer diversity and inclusivity go by the wayside, and let's give us a bunch of white guys do it
Right.
on the book.
Right.
And so it's tough. It's a really tough, tightrope to walk. And hopefully somebody can solve that problem. I know somebody's working on it. So hopefully somebody can
That's
solve that
pretty
problem.
awesome to hear, because I think there's something special just about the Legion, whatever reboot that you want to include it. Like if it's in 70s, 80s, your reboot with Barry
Yeah,
Kitson, Jeff Johns bringing them back in Final Crisis. I think there's always
right.
something like to be told as far as that team is concerned,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, to just see them is pretty cool on that note. But I guess like an aside, I would love to talk to you not just about JLU, but
Hmm.
also your time on the original 2000 series, and sort
Sure.
of delving into the mixes of that, you working on and off with Grant Morrison. My
Hmm.
question to you, because I know that you edited Grant's Vertigo Doom Patrol series. I remember when I read some of those comics, I was like, oh, Mark Waid, editor. I didn't know
Yeah.
that he was on the book. But
Yeah.
how'd you get to meet Grant?
For that. I mean, because I was his editor on Doom Patrol, I got to meet him through that. He came to New York. We had a fabulous time talking. We became good friends, and we're still good friends to this day. It doesn't mean I can understand every word he says with that thick Scottish brogue, but we're very good friends, and I respect him enormously. He may be my favorite currently working comic book writer. So, and that's been true for a long time.
Yeah.
It's Yeah. So working with him was a matter of, knowing that he is at that time I was writing Flash, he was writing Justice League. So I really wanted to do. I needed some time off. I'd been doing Flash for like 6 or 7 years at that
Mm-hmm.
point. I called Grant. I said, "Listen, do you and Mark Millar want to take over the book for a year to let me recharge my batteries, do some other stuff? And I know you're big fans of the Flash." And they were all about it. So Grant, in particular, dug in and started working on Flash. The problem was that put him behind on deadlines for Justice League.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly my year sabbatical takes a weird turn, and now I need to do 4 issues of Justice League for Grant because he's filling in for me on Flash. So that's how we ended up with 4 issues at what, 17, 18, 19, 20, 18, 19, 20, 21, something like that in the early days of
Mm-hmm.
that run. And it was a blast. I mean, I love working with those characters, but same thing a little bit later on with 33, 34, somewhere along in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just fill-ins to help Grant out.
That's pretty thoughtful of, well, both of you guys, just being able to sort of fill in the gaps. And you're
Yeah.
behind on a deadline, it's like, man, I can help a friend out in
Yeah.
need, and push him through. That's pretty thoughtful. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Because I got a chance to reread this. It's the Tower of Babel, deluxe
Yeah.
edition. I kind of wish that they made it an omnibus through, and all the Brian Hitch stuff in there too, with Heaven's Ladder and issues like, I think 47 through 60.
Right.
I, but the thing, I reread, all of that while I was in Florida during the
Mhm.
hurricane.
No, good
Which
Lord.
I was
Okay.
like, I've no, you know what? If I'm gonna die, I'll read out to a cool
We
comic.
went some Mark Waid comics in my hands. If there's the last thing you find me with lying in, and lying in
Right.
the puddle with, it's Mark Waid comic. Okay, I'll take that.
So there you go. But I get it. You got on with the first, the first story. I think that you did issues like 18 and 19 in that run with
Mhm.
our Porter, with Julian September messing with the
Yeah.
timeline, and the Justice League sort of like, oh my goodness, like everything is different. Batman's parents aren't dead, and this, and it's one of my favorite stories too, because I think you not only nailed a lot of those voices, you got to nail Barbara Gordon down, as
Yeah.
Oracle.
Thanks. Yeah.
And how difficult was it, I guess, thinking about unique stories despite the time crunch and the switchbacks off of Flash, like, because I know you had that thing going on too.
Right. But that gets us back to what I was saying earlier. Like,
Right.
I've never seen Martian Manhunter and Oracle have a conversation of any
Mm-hmm.
great length.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what their relationship would be like. And so I built the story, at least the heart of it, the emotion part of it, around the two of them. And that's what I think makes it a memorable story. It's not just plot. It's also about Barbara and Oracle, I rather John and Oracle,
Right.
and how they have to work together to help undo some of this.
And that, I mean, yeah, it turned out to be a pretty phenomenal story. I mean, I know it hit me, right?
Thanks.
Like, just sort of the thought and idea of like things happen for a reason, and trying to erase that sort of, even in the weird messed up world that we live in, there's
Yeah.
always like that affix of not everything pans out the ways that we think we would, because the world that we have is like, it's sort of that thought, right? And getting to
Yeah.
see that like portrayed well in those 2 issues, I was like, man,
Thanks.
I'm immediately hooked on this. And then the next story, right? You have Adam Strange, right? You're reintroducing him
love.
back, right? And
Right.
yep, and you got Alana back, right? Revealed to be alive. Like, what was your inspiration? What did you have to say, like, hey, like, I want to bring Adam Strange back, or was it just like, man, I really want to write Adam Strange, this is the place to do it?
That's more it. It's like, I really want to write I'm Strange. Here's my chance to do it. And, there had been a mini series before me written by Richard Bruning and
Mhm.
drawn by Adam Kubert that was great. I mean, really good, very heavily influenced by the Alan Moore era of DC Comics, where it was very grounded and
Mhm.
real. And when we started talking about Adam Strange and bringing him back, with a nod toward Richard, I didn't want to undo what another writer does, but I really needed Alana for that story. I really needed that, because to me, the key to that entire series is their relationship. The key to that entire series to me is, I have found my true love, but they are 75 light years away, and I can only visit them on occasion. And that long distance romance to me is what drives that series. Again, somebody else could come up with a better take or a different take tomorrow, but that's what I wanted to drill down on and wanted to get back to.
Oh, for sure. And it was cool just again seeing them in a Justice League story that I probably wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. I mean, that was my introduction to the character.
That's my goal,
Right.
right? Bring in the guest stars and make them look cool so that you want to see more of them.
Which is why I think you're going to be doing this a lot. I mean, besides
Yeah.
in JLU, which is what we've been sort of talking about for the last 30 minutes. And also as the book sort of evolved part time to full time, how did that change your approach to the plot threads and storytelling on the title? Was it like sort of happenstance that it evolved into the stories where you were like, let's make Diana the Queen of Fables, and Bruce like, hey, I need to fix everything that I messed up?
Right, right. I mean, it's the original idea was just Tower of Babel. I mean, I knew I was going to take over from Grant, which was a suicide mission, but I knew this was a strong card up my sleeve because I'd had this story percolating for a while. Originally, I originally came up with the basic idea for X-Men. It was going to be Professor Xavier,
Right.
who had come up with all these plans, and it was going to be the Xavier protocols. But at DC, I thought, well, Bruce is the perfect person to have all of the contingency plans against the other leaguers. So I knew that story was happening. I didn't really have a long-term plan because part of the fun of doing an ongoing series is building the plane while you're flying it. Part of the fun is just moving ahead and hoping that you'll have a good idea next month and keeping yourself surprised and leaving yourself flexible so that you're not locked into some sort of 12 issue outline that you planned a long time ago and now you've got to fulfill. And which is dangerous sometimes because you're working in a shared universe. So a lot of times you can come up with your big 8 issue plan, but about issue 4, somebody comes down the hall and said, hey, we decided to kill this character or what have you.
Right.
And suddenly flexibility is important. And I like being flexible with the storytelling. So every story that came, after Power of Babel was just, okay, I need a story for the next 3 or 4 months. What can I do?
Okay. And to get to see that evolve, just sort of, figuring out like, hey, like what can I do with Brian Hitch and, make the story look cool, but also I do appreciate, because that's one thing I think people sort of tend to forget with the whole Batman thing is like he tried, right? He sort of tries to, get like make amends, which is hard to do, which, pardon by like wasn't his own fault. But I think, that's super important just to think about, because Tower of Babel is easily one of I think the 5 most important Batman stories we've had in the last 40 years.
I've always said people tend to misinterpret it, though. I've always said that Batman's sin was not coming up with these plans. Batman's sin was not telling the other leaguers that he was building contingency plans. He didn't have to tell them what they were.
Right.
But that was what made him untrustworthy to most of the leaguers. And that's part of the trust they had to. If he had gone up to every single Justice Leaguer and said, listen, just in case you go nuts, I got your back, everybody would have been great with that.
Right.
They would have been grateful for that. But it's the way he went about it and kept that a secret from everyone that made him be voted out of the league for the first time ever.
And also, too, like, it was supposed to be non-lethal, right? It wasn't supposed to be like the...
Oh, yeah, none of them were lethal.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
But Ra's al Ghul, once he stole them, ramped them up.
Yeah, and having Ra's there, like, just sort of thrown into the windfire and saying... let me because that's something he would, I think, totally do. Like, right, as this overall, like, you're in charge of this big league of painful killers. What do you want to do if you got a hold of these, right? And we saw the world sort of, unfold from that. And I do find it interesting, too, because I think Christopher Priest in his Black Panther run had anti-Galactus contingency plans, from Wakanda and sort of, growing up, or you two sort of having that nearly around the same time. So I don't think it was it's as extreme as I think people intended to be. It's that I think this was just sort of the time where it's like, you guys are thinking deeper of these characters aren't just like one note, like, oh, like I'm this personality or I have this superpower. It's like these guys all like have to, like, these are meta humans, in a world filled with other ones.
Right. And even the best of them, we should probably have some sort of contingency plan against because, mentalists and telepaths go, and world conquerors live all over the DC universe. And you can never tell when somebody's going to get hypnotized into doing something stupid.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty interesting way to see sort of like how Batman has turned up, sort of the activity, especially I think more recent years, right, where it's like, this guy can beat everyone, and it's like I don't think that was the
Right.
intention, right, of your story. Like if
Right.
you put Batman up against Superman in a one-on-one, like I'm sorry, he is getting
No, he's
incinerated.
exactly Superman. Whoever has heat vision wins that fight. So, if you put Batman up against Metamorpho, he's going to turn into plutonium, and then Batman dies.
Mhm.
It's, yeah. The idea was not that Batman can beat everybody. The idea is if you give Batman enough time and resources, he can figure out a way to beat you, not just off the cuff.
Mhm. And getting to see Grant on their Batman run, just sort of play with all
Yeah,
those elements, was I think a
yeah,
pretty incredible. I think that's probably my favorite thing that's sprung out from your concept of Tower of Babel. It's like, getting to see that unfold in RIP, Final Crisis, even when Dick gets to be Batman for the 2 years or so.
yeah.
So we've had a lot of, I think, really great stories come about it. And again, I think it's just a testament to you and Howard Porter getting to work on that book and show out like, hey, this is what happens when Batman
Yeah.
keeps secrets away from everybody.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to talk. Speaking of Batman, I'd love to talk to you about your work that you're doing right now with Chris Samnee on Batman and Robin
What a blessing.
Year
What a
One.
gift.
I have to
Yeah.
say, I had to go to my comic shop, to pick it up day one because I just needed to see like what this was about. I had gotten to, because your Daredevil run was my first Daredevil run,
Oh, cool. Okay.
which was super interesting because I remember going to the comic shop and asking one of the people who worked there, hey, can you give me a couple of recommendations on the summer trip? Like I need to read something on the road. And he was like, hey, this is pretty unconventional for a Daredevil story, but I think you'd like it. So I bought I have the omnibuses now, but I bought the
Mm,
4 oversized hardcovers of it. And I was like,
cool.
okay, this is pretty fun. You getting to do
Thank you.
work with Paulo Rivera, Marcus
Right.
Martin,
Marcos Martin.
and
Right.
right.
Javier Rodriguez. Yeah.
So and now it's like, how is it like, getting back with Samney on this book? Was it something that you two have been talking about behind the scenes for a long time? How did that come about?
It really was. We always knew that we wanted to find more stuff to work together on because he's just so good, and we work together really well. And so he had been trying to sell a Batman project for a long time at DC than I idea he had for something, and it just wasn't taking off. And it wasn't his fault. It was more sort of editorial miscommunication, so forth and so on. But he really wanted to crack. It's Batman's his favorite character, and so he really wanted to crack in. And he called me and said, "Listen, do you want to do something together?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not an idiot. My schedule is really full, but not so full that I will not work with Chris anytime, anywhere." So we started talking about what that story could be. He loves Dick Grayson. That's his favorite Robin, and so I wouldn't think to ask him to draw anything other than that.
Right.
And we started talking about a story. Couldn't come up with a title for it. Couldn't come up with a real through line. We knew what the villain would be. We knew what the basic arc would be, but we still didn't have it until I said, "Well, why don't we just do it Batman and Robin Year One?" And that immediately does two things. It gives us a focus. It tells the readers very clearly that this is a Batman book you need to be paying attention to, is in continuity. It's not just one of 16 other Batman miniseries this month. And it also gave us a chance to really redefine, redefine the relationship between Bruce and Dick
Mhm.
in a way that we've never seen before.
Right. And having the chance to do like these year ones, and you're not immune to it, right? You did it with Wally, and you also did it with the
Yeah,
JLA, which I'll hopefully get to talk to you about in a bit right after.
yeah,
But I think it gives you, like, you and Samney, the opportunity to say, like, let's put our stamp on these characters.
hmm
How can we sort of define, like, this is what the Bruce Dick relationship was like at the start, versus, and I
right.
think that gives you a lot of creative freedom on the title too.
That's the fun of it. Having that level of freedom to be working with what is essentially in a continuity level, a blank slate, and building from start. And that again gives us the idea, or gives me the chance to do that thing I keep talking about, which is I love to take these characters and show you why I think they're cool. And hopefully by the end of it, you will too. And I think at the end of this, people will have a whole new respect for the Bruce and Dick relationship. Because it's, again, like I said, we're coming at it from a much different angle than we've ever seen
Mhm.
before, which is to say, they are good in the field together, but they are not good housemates at this
Right.
point. They are,
Right.
Dick is, Batman takes Dick in thinking they're going to be very much the same because they had the same tragedy
Hmm.
happen to them. And in fact, he's not taking into account everything else is different about that kid.
Right.
And so they, at least at first, basically it's the story of how they end up being a loving father and son, you know,
Duo relationship, whatever you'd like to call it.
yes, exactly. And how you get there because you don't automatically become best friends day one.
I think it's sort of like now I'm thinking, you were because you wrote Superman Birthright, where you had sort of the ending already in mind and you know where to
Yeah,
get to it, but you just
yeah,
didn't know like, oh, like what are the steps I'm gonna take so I can get to that
right,
end point. And it feels
right.
like sort of the same thing here. It's like, okay, we know where Dick and Bruce are going to get, or like have an idea to get to that at some point. It's just like the steps taking there are gonna
Right.
be a while because they're two characters that look at this point, right, in their lives, look at the
Mhm.
world completely differently.
Right. So we've got a last page already in mind. We know the ending beat. So you're right. How do we get there in a way that makes sense, that is logical, and yet leaves room for surprise?
What makes or what when you and Chris are writing or figuring out the plot, figuring out the relationship between these two characters,
Mhm.
what makes this relationship between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson specifically so different and so unique from every single other character's relationships with each other in DC Universe?
The fact that you would think they would be the same. Again, they have
Mm-hmm.
virtually identical origins. Their parents were killed by bad guys and they were left alone to pick up the pieces
Mm-hmm.
and figure out how they want to deal with it. So, but in this case, there's just like very few people have done much with the idea that here's this kid who has been living hand to mouth in the circus for all these years, and suddenly he's rich. Here's a kid who's never been to public school, and suddenly he's thrust into public school whether he wants to or not,
Mm-hmm.
wants to be or not. And so all of that has its impact on his relationship with Bruce. Like I said, he is also, I mean, in Batman and Robin Year One, we're digging a little deeper into the idea that if you're Gotham Social Services, you don't just hand a orphan over to a billionaire playboy.
Right, right.
You know, there's checks and balances in place here.
Mm-hmm.
There is a social worker who shows up in issue 2 who's going to be a runner throughout the entire series, who is keeping a very close eye on this because she thinks it's a terrible idea,
Mm-hmm.
and she's not wrong.
She's not wrong, no.
Um, but so that puts a whole nother level of scrutiny on the Bruce and Dick relationship, and lot more friction on it because you know it, Dick Dick has to behave in certain ways if the social worker's around, but if the social worker's not around, he gets to be a different kind of kid. And Alfred is losing his mind because he didn't have to raise any children,
Right.
and he has a daughter, but he has a really estranged relationship with his daughter. Bruce was never a kid. Bruce was a child only until such time as his parents were killed, and then he suddenly became 25 years old
Mm-hmm.
in his, in terms of his attitude, his emotions.
Right.
So neither Bruce nor Alfred know the first thing about
Raising a kid.
raising a kid and raising a kid who is on the cusp of his teens. And it is a constant source of frustration to both of them because this is not a problem that Batman can solve through chemistry or detection.
It's one where he actually has to foster the relationship, especially with someone as emotionally broken as him.
Right.
It's going to be difficult, like especially like if you're thinking of like, okay, here's this guy whose entire life has been molded by trauma and tragedy, and
Hmm.
now all of a sudden you have this enthusiastic little mind that doesn't know a single thing about like some of these villains he's facing, right?
Right.
It's like, I think that just adds a level of like what like the stuff that you can do between the both of them in the book, and why I'm so
Right.
excited for the next 11 issues.
Nice. And the other enormous difference is, if you think about it, Batman is a solo act. Batman is used to being in a situation where he doesn't have to depend on anybody else. He's not had a partner before. He doesn't lend himself to partners. Conversely, every night of Dick Grayson's life depended on him having partners who could catch him if he falls.
Right.
His entire life and death depended on that. So you put these two together, and neither of them knows how to work with each other.
And I mean, it's a beautiful part and notion too of, again, just the differences, even like the stark similarities, right? And
Yeah.
pushing that all aside because these two look at life a different way. And you have also, I mean, you're obviously writing Batman Superman World's Finest now, which if you want to call it a Batman book, I guess it would depend on who you're talking to, but Batman is a key, he is a key part of that book, right? But you had the only issue that I've read of you with like Batman as a solo was a one shot called Batman in Barcelona Dragon's Night with Diego Olmos, where he solves crimes in Barcelona, spoiler alert.
Right.
And then you and Brian Augustine, also got to work on Batman Legends of the Dark Knight Annual number 4, I believe it is, with Citizen Kane, right? So
the Elseworlds, yeah.
The Elseworlds, right? So, I guess my question is like, how does your approach to Bruce like now sort of differ, like you looking at him, because you're more of the Superman, like I've always looked at you as more of a Superman guy than a Batman guy. So how is the difference between the 15 plus years or so differ in that fact of, and I'm getting to right Bruce now?
Right, they're different. I mean, all three are different Batmans. The World's Finest Batman is different than the Year One Batman, is different than the Justice League Unlimited Batman. They're just the same guy, but at different stages of his career, and I have to bear that in mind at all times. There is a lightness to Batman. I mean, lightness is the wrong word. There's less of a grimness, more of a superheroishness to Batman in World's Finest, because he's there with Superman, because he's there with Dick Grayson as an older kid, and the menaces and threats are just a little less grounded than the Year One Batman would face. So he's still, to me, the voice is still the same. I know Bruce's voice intimately, but the idea that Batman is flexible enough as a character to understand and embrace some of the absurdity of the DC universe that a younger Batman could never have. I mean, that was the whole point of doing the Batmite arc, right? Is that there's a whole speech in there about how he never liked Batmite,
right?
But now he really sees what this character wants to be, and he can't just be a jerk to Batmite all the time, because that makes Batman a jerk. I guess basically that's it. Batman is a jerk. But Batman Year One can be a jerk. Unlimited, he can kind of be a jerk, but in World's Finest, he shouldn't be a jerk.
Right. Because he has to go, bounce off, and Clark's there. It's like, you don't want to mess with Clark on a bad day.
Right. Yeah.
But again, you're also not immune to writing origin stories from any standpoint. Like, and Born to Run is one of my favorites. But you got to work with Brian Augustine and Barry Kitson on JLA. Like, how was that working with Brian on that book to sort of reboot post-crisis? Say, hey, this is the Justice League origin of that.
Yeah, that was a blast, because I mean, something that Brian and I had wanted to do for a while, and there was at that point no real definitive post-crisis origin of this team. And Barry Kitson was aboard just because we'd worked together on so many other stuff. We'd worked together on Legion, Legion. We'd worked together on our own book, Empire. And Barry likes the design of those characters of that age, that Silver Age. And so it was a blast. I mean, Brian and I co-plotted everything anyway. I mean, whether his book was on the name as co-plotter or not, when he was my editor, we were best friends. Again, pouring one out. Rest in peace, Brian. But we were very close. And so every time I picked up the phone to talk to him as my editor in Flash, we would just throw ideas back and forth trying to play, can you top this? And that was the fun of working on that book. Same with Justice League Year One. It was just a constant game of, can you top this? Which is great.
And I mean, that completely sounds phenomenal. And again, all of the pages poured out from that book, it felt like you two were completely in sync. And also with the Kitson on arc, it was like, man, I can't name you one comic of Kitson's that I just like haven't been impressed by.
No, storytelling is always impeccable, which I love.
I completely agreed. And also, did you, for the post-crisis on Infinite Earths retcons and adjustments? Was it editorial saying like, hey, you got to have Wonder Woman replaced by Black Canary, and then Superman and Batman being pushed off the side? Or is that an idea that you two or you three all sprung up and said, like, let's do this instead of the big three, the Trinity being there?
That was editorial. I mean, the Wonder Woman thing was editorial, and so was Superman and Batman being founding members. That was a post-crisis edict given to us with the idea that we can't, that at that point in DC continuity, Wonder Woman was fairly fresh to the DC universe, had not been around for the early days. So it was when I was editing Secret Origins that writer Keith Giffen and dialoguer Bob Fleming and I sat down. We talked about, okay, how do we tell the origin of the Justice League and do it without Wonder Woman and without Batman? It's easier to do without Batman and Superman because Batman and Superman were not big players in the Justice League in the early days of the 60s for the first year or so. Wonder Woman was a hard nut to crack. And without her, Keith's original idea was to replace her with a Golden Age character called Miss America, who is a real character.
Interesting.
And doing so in a way that she did not survive that first mission, and therefore that is one of the reasons they call themselves the Justice League of America as an homage to that character. It's a clever idea, but I just felt weird about starting off kicking off the Silver Age of the Justice League with a gratuitous death.
Right.
So, of a character that you've never heard of before and don't really care about. So we went with Black Canary instead. That was our only option. It wasn't necessarily, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't have been my first choice, but given the options available to us, that's the one that made the most sense.
Oh, for sure. And like I said, it all worked out, in the end. And I think it's one of your more underrated books that I think people just don't, because again, like Born to Run is amazing, but I think the work you did with those two creators specifically, and obviously RIP to the late great Brian Augustine, getting to see that is, it's a nice touch. And again, a Justice League book.
Thanks.
I think everyone should read. Let's quickly move alongside to two more books, and I think we can wrap this interview up, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
The first of which is you are doing, as you mentioned earlier, an Action Comics weekly series spanning from issues 1070 to 1083, where you and Clayton Henry are sort of like on the main arc, and then Mariko Tamaki with the backups. Now, like, you're not immune to sort of like doing weekly work, because you were one of the 4 brain trusts of 52,
right?
With Grant, Greg, and Jeff. I guess my question is, like, how does this sort of differ between working with those 3 and Keith Giffen with the storyboards and this, where it's like it's you pushing along the strings?
Really the difference is the release schedule, in the sense that with 52 we were working in real time. We weren't. We had a head start, but we were still turning in scripts every single week. Whereas with this one, we just knew it was a 12-issue slot. And so I started work on this book over a year ago. And so I've been treating it like a monthly assignment, because that's as many pages as Clayton Henry can do in an issue. And there's still subplot pages done by Michael Scheffler, who is doing a really good job. So the two of them are carrying that, and we can make the weekly schedule without any problem to fit the last issue he's working on right now. So that's really it. It was a matter of, it wasn't like 52 and we're trying to write it as fast as we can. This was this could have been 12 monthly issues of Action Comics, and just fit the schedule better. Yeah.
So interesting stuff. And alongside you again, Mariko Tamaki is doing Supergirl. Was that sort of like, was it DC saying like, you two are going to be on this weekly and you guys got to like adjust to it? Or is it just like, you two are working separately? How did that all process out?
We are working separately, but that's because I'm not about to tell Mariko what to do, because she's great.
I agree.
Yeah. And Skylar Patridge is doing amazing work in that backup series, and it's kind of fun. And no one's called them out on this yet, I don't think. It's kind of fun that when I was growing up, Action Comics was Superman with a Supergirl backup story. Mm-hmm. And that's now what we have again for however long a period of time. Yeah.
And I hope Kara gets her own book someday too. Like when
that movie hits, she'll be everywhere. I guarantee it.
I hope so. Because we have Karen, right? And she's had her own book for, in the last year and a half or so now, and and I love Karen too, but like it'd be nice to see Kara get sort of her own,
Yep.
spotlight in as well. And that brings me to sort of the last book that I want to talk about, which is your Superman Last Days of Lex Luthor, with the aforementioned Brian Hitch, and you getting to work with them on
the long delayed. Yeah. It just was put on the schedule way too soon. It was just put on the schedule way too soon. And editorial cops to that. So I think the current plan, the first issue came out, I don't know, in the Stone Age. The current plan, I think, is to shoot for March or April of next year, so we can make sure we have all 3 issues in hand, complete, ready to go. And Kevin Nolan is halfway through the 3rd issue right now, so we're getting there. And I think the plan is to reissue issue 1
as a second print.
As a second printing, just to remind people it exists and let them finish out the story rather than have to wait 3 years between issues. It's really, no one's happy with the way this has come out. But when the whole thing is said and done, I think it's going to be like my last statement on Lex Luthor.
Oh man, because it feels sort of like a spiritual successor to your Lex Luthor in Superman Birthright.
Very much so. To my mind, it's an unofficial sequel. Yeah.
And it's like, you two are getting to work, you're working with Brian Hitch, and also like, of course, like Clark is going to try to help. Like he's got a spirit of gold. Like, it's like, what I know that a lot of people give Batman a lot of flack for, oh, you let the Joker alive, you let Two-Face alive and all this. But like, Clark, I think would be one of those characters, right? Where it's like, he's going to try,
It's like Lex
sense.
Luthor comes to him and says, I'm dying and I need help to find a cure or else I'm going to die. He knows Superman's going to say yes, even though he doesn't want to. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've had a good time.
Thank you. And thank you, Mark, so much for your time.
All right, great. Take care.